How do you think your anxiety developed? What do you think is the real problem here? Who are you? What do you believe about yourself? Like, these all go into the picture that you have to paint to kind of see what you're going to do next.
Some of my colleagues who are trained in different modalities, and they're like, no, you must address the trauma first. Is there a part to play in that? Yes. For me, though, working with disordered anxiety, I will look at the barriers to people believing that they are the coping technique, that they are the strength.
This person with this big following is telling me what my anxiety is. No, they're telling what their anxiety was. Your
Uh,
narrative really matters, and your helper has to understand that, be sensitive to that, and match it. We can rely on general principles, but you have to apply those within the differences.
that's where those narratives can play a part.
Welcome to Disordered. This is episode 79 of the podcast. Today we're asking the question, what is your anxiety narrative? I am Drew Linsalata, a therapist practicing under supervision in the state of New York, specializing in the treatment of anxiety and anxiety disorders, one of the co-hosts of this fine podcast, a former sufferer of anxiety disorders, OCD, and depression for many years of my life, but better now, and also an author, social media guy, educator, advocate, anxiety nerd.
I'm Joshua Fletcher, also known as Anxiety Josh. I'm a psychotherapist who specializes in working with anxiety and anxiety disorders. Previous sufferer, based in Manchester in the UK. And it's a pleasure to be a co host of this podcast.
Yes, it is. Let me balance that Hail Britannia quickly. Thank you. Today, we're going to talk about anxiety narratives, which I think is a great topic. Credit to Josh on this one. Like, what do you mean by anxiety narrative? What are you talking about? What does that mean?
So, anxiety is spoke about a lot in the wellness sphere, even in the therapeutic sphere. People have their different theories as to where anxiety comes from and how to address it. And I thought we'd use today as a way of kind of, I love a conceptualization, Drew. I'm boring, but it's really important. Looking at your anxiety narrative where it plays a part. Some people get anxious because of things outside of an anxiety disorder. Some people are well in the midst of an anxiety disorder. Understanding and conceptualizing where your anxiety comes from and originates is super important. And we'll also kind of talk about a lot of popular theories and narratives around it, because I think it's really important to get down like on paper, like and or just formulate in your mind what the problem is here.
Yeah. And that narrative is important as the person, the helper, right? In like a therapeutic relationship, like, we're going to bring certain narratives into that based on our theoretical orientations and the way we conceptualize anxiety disorders. So it's both, like, your helper will have their narrative and you have your own also. Like, what do you think about it? One of the first things I'm going to try and figure out is, what do you think about your situation? Because my narrative doesn't matter until I hear yours. So, like, how do you think your anxiety developed? What do you think is the real problem here? Who are you? What do you believe about yourself? Like, these all go into the picture that you have to paint to kind of see what you're going to do next. The narrative really drives the car in a way down the path. So it's
Yeah, and,
important.
and, and you speak about values a lot and where the values fit into the narrative.
Yeah.
I think the first port of call, though, is to understand kind of what type of anxiety you have. Why are you anxious? For a lot of
Yeah.
people listening to this podcast, I'm anxious because my threat response is misfiring, usually down to accumulated stress, or whether it's slow accumulated stress or a traumatic event, and we're stuck in this state of fight or flight, fearing it, misinterpreting it. So the beginning of the narrative for a lot of people listening to this podcast is, how do I stop fearing this threat response and misinterpreting it and getting off the hamster wheel, which is something I always bang on about.
Mhm.
But at the same time, when you're looking for help with anxiety, or you may have heard this from a therapist or from a mental health guru, is that you might hear conflicting information. So some
Yeah.
therapists might say, well, you can't get rid of your anxiety because you've not addressed this childhood issue. Some people may say you need to somatically experience something in order to process stuff, which it can play a part. But again, if you're struggling with chronic anxiety, misfiring threat response, intrusive thoughts, and obsession and fixation over your symptoms and catastrophizing, for me and probably Drew, it's how do we calm down this threat response first so we can think straight?
Yeah. What's so important there is so many times the first thing people want to know is, why is this happening to me? So, like, first, I'm going to ask, well, why do you think it's happening to you? Because that matters, right? I'm not going to tell you what it is. My job isn't to tell you. It'll help you interpret, but why do you think this is happening? Where do you think this comes from? And if it is a clear, I'm anxious because I'm anxious in our context, now the therapist's theoretical orientation or their narrative that they kind of bring into treating anxiety is, well, here's where I think this comes from. And for people like us, it's like, well, it almost doesn't matter where it comes from because you can't probably clearly figure that out while you're burning anyway. Like,
Mm,
so that's you're not going to have a really fruitful search for maybe the root cause or whatever it is while you're on fire. So our narrative, I think, as anxiety specialists, is going to be kind of like, well, we really care more about the here and now and what's happening right now. And then if over time the past comes up and it gives you the opportunity to sort of dig into that a little bit or do some introspection, cool. But we're not going to start there. Whereas maybe other people might come into the therapy room, even clients, they have a narrative that has to do with, this connects directly to my dad, or this connects directly to this event. Okay, well, I got to listen to that then. And
mm.
some therapists will also assume, well, this must connect to your past in some way, or this is how we treat this. And it will vary so widely, which would make some of this stuff really confusing, don't you think?
Definitely. And when you're looking at like trauma narratives as well, that can be confusing to someone with disordered anxiety.
Hmm.
There's a lot of therapists and some of my colleagues who are trained in different modalities, and they're like, no, you must address the trauma first. It's like, no, I'm going to go with Drew's violent analogy of us being on fire. Let's put the fire out first
Yep.
before we do that. Now, is there a part to play in that? Yes. For me, though, working with disordered anxiety, I will look at the barriers to people believing that they are the coping technique, that they are the strength.
Mm.
That's where those narratives can play a part. Well, actually, I don't believe in myself. When I was growing up, my mum and dad were pieces of crap and always put me down and bullied me and put so much pressure, and I was been in rubbish relationships and I don't feel very good about myself. I don't have much self-belief, so don't ask me to go and do an exposure on public transport because I'm not feeling great. So for
Yeah.
me, I'd look at that as a therapist. I go, okay, well, that's a barrier to you seeing that you're the coping technique. You know, I think Drew and I were a bit lucky in our anxiety narrative because stress accumulated. We developed an anxiety disorder through our own
Yeah.
paths, and luckily we were like, well, what do I need to do to get better? Let's pull up my boots, roll up my sleeves. Let's do the exposure a little bit at a time and go easy. And we were already our own friend.
Hmm.
But your narrative might be, I need to be my own friend first
Right.
before I start doing this because you're the person where Craig the critic comes in and stops you and beats you up. And what's your anxiety narrative? Also, as well, if you've got someone feeding in your ear, oh no, it's because of trauma and you got strapped in, you need to do this and do that. The narrative, you might not even know what it is to get better. And I think that's why I wanted to talk about it today. It was also inspired by um, someone who messaged. Yeah, that was it. I'll just read this message out. It's from a fellow therapist. Love this message. So, dear Drew and Josh, thank you so much for all your work. I'm a therapist, and your approach to treating and understanding anxiety has helped me to support so many people who are living with anxiety. Thank you. Makes I think it's really good that our work's influencing that. I
Yeah.
wondered if you could talk about somatic experiencing when treating anxiety. And it's a really good question. Do you feel it's helpful or can it be counterproductive? Love to hear your thoughts on this. And thanks again for everything. That was from Layla. That was Drew.
Truth be told, I couldn't wait to hit the button. Thank you for thank you, Layla.
Just
You
get to the
added
end of the
some
sentence.
extra time morning.
Such a good
It's a great
question because
question.
it's an example of another narrative.
Yes, exactly. And I think what's so important about Layla's question is what you're seeing here is a clinician who is open to looking at other ways of doing this. Like, well, maybe I like somatic experiencing for whatever reason, but let me see if what the feedback is on using that in this particular context. I could not like this question more. I love it.
This is,
And I
and
think,
that's what makes, in my opinion, Layla a great therapist. I'm
me too.
open to other
Yeah.
narratives as to why this is happening.
Yeah, I would agree with that because when you said it could be so confusing, and this is also why it's so important that It's not just what the helper thinks. It can't be only my narrative. It can't be, because otherwise you run the risk of, well, let me tell you my story, and I'm going to hold that up as your model for wellness or improvement or your well being. It can't be. My narrative was my narrative. And you pointed it out really eloquently. You're right. For people who maybe don't have the same background that you and I were lucky enough to have, I couldn't just say, "Oh, I just got in the car and drove every morning." Yeah, I did. That is what I did, but I can't just say, "Well, then you do that. Go ahead, you do that. Come to my workshop and my mastermind, and I'll just tell you what I did." And then when you can't seem to get a grip on it, and you don't know why, it's going to feel like you're broken because, I don't know, I have this person with this big following is telling me what my anxiety is. No, they're telling what their anxiety was. So like your
Yeah.
narrative really matters, and your helper has to understand that, be sensitive to that, and match it. And here we have somebody who sends in a question that clearly wants to be able to match where their clients are.
Yeah,
Hello.
and it's really refreshing, that question as well.
Yeah.
And again with narrative, if you're someone on social media scrolling
Yeah.
and you see in your feed and there's another person who you can maybe relate to, maybe have the same symptoms, the same what ifs, the same worries, and
Yeah.
they get to a certain place and their narrative was they don't live your life. You can relate to their,
Mhm.
phenomenological experience at the time. But as Drew says, it's a very one track approach. It worked for me, so therefore
Yeah.
it should work for you. And I mean, it's a reason why I like training to be a therapist because you get to see nuance and things and stuff like that. It's not just, one coach with one method and this should work. Because if it doesn't work for you, maybe you've got other hurdles that need a more
Mhm.
in depth exploration with a therapist first.
Yeah.
It's important because you can end up feeling like a failure.
Yeah. I'm like, nothing's ever going to, or you're hopeless. Nothing's ever going to work for me. That's not true. And I think it's funny because narrative is woven into the, we hear it every day and we get it, but everyone's different. Everyone's different. Like sometimes people will come back at me with like, but everybody's different. That is correct. Everybody's different. We can rely on general principles that are generalizable across very large populations, but you have to apply those within the differences. So, like, yeah, the principles of exposure are the same from you to me to anybody listening here, but the way we would apply them is going to depend on the person's experiences, their personality, their beliefs, their entire narrative. That's how we learn how to apply the principles. So it's really important. And if you're confused as to what your own personal narrative is, the first thing you might ask a helper is, where does this come from? And the best thing would be to try and work together to see where they think it comes from, where you think it comes from. And then you can kind of go from there.
I think what we're trying to say is like always question narratives and stuff and see if it applies to you.
Yeah.
Unless it's the narrative that Drew and I are trying to propagate. That's the correct narrative and everything.
Yeah, I had that was waiting. I was just waiting for that. But let's talk
Well,
about
what would
that.
our narrative be though? I would be like,
Yeah.
what's the barriers towards practicing the willful tolerance of uncertainty? The willful tolerance of uncertainty, surrendering to uncertainty,
Yep.
the gap between the oh my god to the oh well, which I
Right.
love.
Yeah.
But what are the barriers that are getting to that as well? And that's where kind of therapy and a kind of your own narrative comes in. So
Yeah.
if you're that person who, you've seen online that this technique worked for so many people, why is it not working for me? Different narrative, but maybe those barriers play a part. When you think about self-esteem, think about grief, your own fears, your type of anxiety. The
Mhm.
approach to agoraphobia is different to maybe OCD and intrusive thoughts.
Yeah. Yeah.
The approach to GAD is different from that. So, yeah, crafting your own narrative to recovery is really important. Um, and yeah, I think it's just something that's people forget. It's like, what's the one thing to help me get better? You, but let's
Yeah.
have a look at what's in the way of getting you towards realizing that you are the person that can tolerate this.
One of the things that, and I promised that I would, before we hit the record button, like, well, I have a theory. Josh was like, oh, do tell.
Oh, he's not
Yeah.
told me this theory yet either.
Yeah, it's not a theory. Maybe it's more of an observation or a take on this. And maybe it's going to sound like we're tooting our own horns, but it's our podcast. So maybe we'll do that once in a while. In my my limited experience as a therapist, but a lot of experience interacting in the anxiety community for 10 plus years. What I feel like I see, and you tell me if you agree, or maybe I'm off base, I might be off base, is I think people that specialize in treating anxiety disorders And there it is again. Seriously? Sorry, guys. One of the things that I think we tend to do is like, yeah, these are the things we use. These are the tools. These are the methods. This is the modalities we use. But I would never tell somebody that every single problem that walks in the door is literally like an ERP explorer. It can't be. It can't be. Like your past doesn't matter. We're only dealing in the here and now. And this is the way. This is the way. I used to end my podcast that way. There's a joke, but like, whereas sometimes I feel like in other therapeutic circles, it's like, no, everything is pain, everything is trauma, everything is boundaries, everything is like, no, how could that be? And I feel like maybe we're a little bit more flexible, or am I just claiming high ground now, like the pitchforks and torches coming out? I don't know. I can't possibly imagine that I could tell everybody I ever meet with a mental health problem, do this. But I
Mm,
hear that narrative all the time from other areas of the therapy world and the helping world. Does that
yeah.
make sense?
Yeah, it does
Like,
make sense. Yeah, yeah. I think it amplifies the importance of getting that correct formulated narrative for yourself. For example, so when I struggled with health anxiety, it wasn't so long after losing my brother and my dad.
mm,
So naturally, my threat response, Captain Amygdala, is going, maybe the threat is you're dying. Naturally,
yeah.
naturally. And
Why wouldn't it be?
but for some therapists, it was like, no, no, this sounds like unprocessed grief manifesting as this. I was like, well, maybe, maybe not. So my threat response is only trying to find reasons as to why I feel so anxious. Yes, my threat response is probably triggered due to stress.
Mhm,
So I love the stress jug analogy. I always use that as part of forming a narrative.
mhm,
Why is your stress jug overflowing? Well, what's in your stress jug is different to everyone else's. And what can we do to empty it? For me, grief was filling up that stress jug. And because the threat response couldn't really pick up on any danger in my environment, it would pick up on aches and niggles and anomalies because it's trying to help me find where it is. So
yeah,
my narrative was understanding, yeah, I'm going through grief, which was stress, which adds to my stress jug. So processing that grief did help. But in the moment, when the jug's overflowing, my narrative was to no, I need to stop engaging with this topic for a minute to teach the brain this uncertainty is expected, but
mhm,
it's okay. And I need to learn the initial principles. Whereas going straight towards grief and reliving traumatic moments wasn't going to initially help my stress jug to overflow,
uh-huh,
and that's just an example of kind of crafting the narrative to recovery here. Don't get me wrong, I went back and did explore that, and it
yeah,
was really nice from a preventative point of view,
yep.
not a reactionary point of view.
And I think in our context where people are anxious because they're anxious, while certainly there were precipitating circumstances there, if you were sitting across from me, one of the common questions that I know you hear all the time is, well, this is what's going on in my life, blah, 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 and now I'm stuck on health themes. I can't get these sticky thoughts about my health out of my, okay, well, you just told me that this horrible thing happened to your dad and your brother. Like, why wouldn't you think that? Is the
Mm,
first thing I got to tell somebody because they're wondering, what's wrong with me? Why is my brain stuck? Why? Well, first of all, let's acknowledge that like those are going to feed in. Why would you not be thinking that is a thing I say all the time in my sessions now. Why would
yeah,
you not be thinking that? Like,
yeah,
let's
it's
come
not a bad
out here.
thing to
I'm
think.
broken. Right. You're not broken. That's not the problem here. Like, of course you're worried about that. Why wouldn't you be given what you just lived through? So now we got to incorporate that into the work. Right. So,
And I didn't react to it. And talking of that, actually, we had a really good dinner anyway, didn't we? On a similar theme of health, about trying to. I just
yes,
remembered. Yeah, we got that.
we got a lot of did anyways and stuff today, which is really good. Well, no,
Yeah.
we have a question about health. So we have a
Question
question
about.
about checking health compulsively. Well,
Yeah, it was something about I've stopped. I'm checking, and now I've stopped trying to fix it and leave it alone or something.
oh, yes, that one, that's a did it anyway. Yeah, well,
Yeah,
okay,
let's
so this
play
is
that
right,
because
let's see.
it feeds into stuff nicely.
Yeah, it kinda does. Alright, let's hear it. It's a good one.
Hi, Drew and Josh. I want to give you a few I did it anyways. I've been really focusing on working hard on my anxiety, but also not working so hard on it, if that makes sense, and letting things be and just going with the flow a bit more. And this summer, really wanted to do some beach yoga. I saw it last year and never got to do it. So this year I was determined to do it, and I did it anyway. Just me make it more of a so it's not in the driving seat the whole time, and I am more in the driving seat now of my life. So thank you both, and hopefully I'll have some more. I did it anyways in the coming months and might pop back up and tell you about those too. Thanks again. Bye.
Oh, I hit the wrong button. Sorry, guys. Oh, you know what I wiped out? I wiped out our applause. I'm sorry.
I've got it.
Round
Wait.
of applause. Hang on, here it is. There you go. Thank you. To make up for my production incompetency. That was a great bit anyway. You know what I love about this one? I the narrative, if we bring it back to our topic, sometimes even changes over time. So, like, this is a person who I have to do something about this. I have to do something that becomes part of the narrative. Like, this is I have to fix this. I have to fix this. I have to interact with this. I have to find a technique. And then suddenly, it over time it shifts to like, no, no, wait. I tried to do less about this because I'm accidentally putting it in the driver's seat. What a great turnaround this is! I
So
think.
good. You changed your narrative there. It's such a good did it anyway.
Yeah, yeah,
And
really good.
I love
Thanks
that.
for saying.
I've
Yeah,
stopped trying to fix it constantly and just let it. I'm in the driver's seat, but it can come along with me. Well done. You just
yeah,
switch the narrative there as well. You realize, and particularly with stuff like health anxiety and stuff, we get a lot of these questions as well. Like, and I think we've got one later on, but like it's about in the mainstream general wellness stuff. You know, check yourself, check, do this. Every time there's an anomaly, you must check, you must act. When we see anxiety and disordered anxiety itself as the anomaly and all the symptoms it throws at us, we can get pulled in. Our narrative is, well, everyone keeps telling me that I should keep checking and stuff. Maybe not now. Maybe it's time to craft my own narrative here because this lies outside this kind of realm of information.
yeah. The narrative building, your narrative, not the helper's narrative. Sometimes that's a difficult thing to build. Like, if you're really confused, you don't really know, and you're working to try and figure out what your narrative is and sort of formulate and conceptualize this. Sometimes you're forced to confront longstanding beliefs, like cultural things. I've had people that, like, they come from a culture, which is totally fine, where things like intuition and gut feelings were really important, like in the family culture. And so the narrative that they come in is has that baked into it, because why wouldn't it? They were raised in that culture, and it's really hard for them to rebuild that narrative around, ooh, like following everything I think as intuition or messages or gut feelings that I must honor. I'm gonna have to put that aside for a little bit. So sometimes your personal narrative is built based on your culture, your
Mm,
upbringing, your beliefs, like those imputed beliefs that you have. And like, ooh, now they stand in the way of a constructive narrative. So I got to do some work on that. Like, it's a complicated puzzle sometimes. That's okay if it is.
yeah, it really is. It's quite particularly when you're looking at therapy narratives as well. Like
Mhm.
a lot of therapists have therapy narratives. I work with some kind of hardcore purist therapists that are like, no, this is the narrative and the modality I'm trained in, and all suffering is because of this theory. It's like, no, be open like Layla, and just be like, well, maybe not for this person because we're all different, and it's really important to realize.
Well, should we answer Layla's question? We actually didn't answer it. She's like, okay, guys, can you actually answer the question at this point if she's listening?
Sorry.
uh, yeah, I didn't even think about that. Like, oh, maybe we should actually answer
She
the
asked,
question.
I
Yeah.
wondered if you could talk about somatic experiencing when treating anxiety. Do you feel it's helpful? It can be counterproductive. Well, for most people with anxiety disorders, I'd say it can be seen as an urgent reaction to anxiety.
Yeah.
If I'm going to, but also you can use it. Interestingly, you could use it as an exposure. So
Right.
I don't know. So it depends why you're using somatic experiencing. If someone's afraid of air hunger,
Mhm,
then you could use somatic experiencing as a form of interoceptive exposure. Like, well, if
mhm.
breathing scares you, let's get used to breathing and experiencing that and the discomfort that comes with it.
Yeah.
But if you're going, well, if I actually, where are you feeling that emotion in your body? For some people, and particularly me, who's neurodivergent, I'm like, I don't know what you mean by where do I feel the emotion in my body. My stomach is tense because I'm anxious. My chest's tense because I'm anxious. It's not because there's some stored deep emotion there. I don't believe that stuff. Lots of people do. They love it. And
Yep.
I'm like, and it might work and it might be a very neurotypical thing. But for someone who's very neurodivergent, if you ask me, like, where do you feel that fear and grief? I'm like, everywhere. I need to go to the toilet. My heart's pounding. I don't
Yeah.
know. My arm. I don't know. I don't know where it is. So it depends. For some people, they might be like, you know what? I actually can feel that fear, that anticipation in my stomach, and sitting with that somatic experiencing and being okay with that symptom, that I'm afraid of could work, but it's not going to work for everyone. It certainly wouldn't have worked for me.
That's really, that's fascinating. I just learned something right there.
Oh,
The way
it's just a
your
fountain of knowledge,
conceptualization.
lad.
Yeah, 100%. I really dig that. Like, well, where do you feel it in your body? I don't know. Like, okay, that's not the way you experience it. That was really that was actually very educational for me. To
It's
me,
just
I think
like,
the somatic experience thing becomes I don't think you can do anxiety disorder recovery based on the physical symptoms of anxiety. If that's where you're hooked, right? You can't not do some form of somatic experiencing. It's going to be part of the work. It's just baked in anyway. I think the danger part there is where the physical experiences are then interpreted in some way. Ugh, that gets a
yes,
little rough. Like we're going to try and find meaning. Like I love the explanation. This is your body naturally responding the way scared bodies do. So like what I was like, well, are you scared right now? Yeah, I'm really scared. Okay, well, what do you feel in your body? My heart is racing. I'm sweating. Like, yeah, that's your body doing scared body things. End of story.
yeah,
Maybe later they might be able to say, "Oh, that reminded me of when," or "This is why I feel that." Okay, cool. But for now, trying to interpret the somatic experience and add meaning to it, that's a problem most of
yes,
the time, I think, in
yes.
anxiety
And I
disorders.
think that's a narrative which is counterproductive,
Yes.
particularly for people with anxiety disorders. And it was certainly counterproductive in my recovery as well.
Yeah.
When I think I've said this before on this podcast, but I went into train to be a therapist, very happy, and left trading feeling like there was something wrong with me because maybe through the act of transference or whatnot. But like this, I left convinced that I had trapped trauma and grief and all this stuff.
Yeah.
And actually, looking back years now, I was like, kind of made me more unwell. I was really quite happy and content. That's why I
Yeah.
wanted to be a therapist. And a lot of these narratives was fed on by my anxiety. So my
This
my brain was like, "What if you've got trapped unresolved trauma?
right.
What if you've been through a lot, Josh?" And then I noticed I slowly started to ruminate more,
Yeah.
and do all these things, and I was like, and then I got pulled back in, and it's really interesting. Now, don't get me wrong; some of those narratives are really helpful for some people, particularly
Mhm.
those people who are not the opposite of the inwards compulsion. They
Yeah.
afraid to feel. They don't even care. They don't even check in with themselves about how they're feeling. Their awareness of their emotions are zero.
Mhm.
Really helpful for their progression narrative. But
Yep.
if you're listening to this podcast, odds on that ain't going to help you.
One of the more common bits of feedback to hear from a big social media audience is, okay, well, your body's doing scared body things. Your job now is to let it do that without interacting with it. And like, what else is important to you right now? What else can you engage in while it's doing that? And sometimes what I get is, yeah, but aren't I avoiding? I have to feel it more.
Mm,
I have to sit with it. I have to let it express itself. Like you're right. That's correct. But the narrative can sometimes lead an anxious person with an anxiety disorder to feel like there's a right way to do I have to do it more. But isn't that avoiding? Shouldn't I just sit with and find the meaning in the churning in my stomach? No,
mixed narrative
that's a
there,
problem. Yeah,
contrasting narrative. No, also
yeah.
this finding meaning and stuff. It's just like no people with globus sensation. This is one I hear a lot. I get globus sensation. It feels like there's something in my throat.
Mhm.
And I hear this from therapists, from lots of people. That's a symbol. It's a symbol of the unsaid. Like, or I'm
Yeah,
just going to
or
throw
hear
Occam's
me out.
razor at you here.
Yeah.
It could be because your posture's forward, your head's tilted forward, your neck muscles are constantly tense.
Mm,
Your digestion's gone. You probably got lots of trapped wind, acid reflux, whatever, because of a constantly firing threat response. And then you get this globus sensation because of your tense neck muscles, your esophageal muscles, and your posture. Just like you'd get chest pain. So it could be my boring non-Netflix answer,
yeah.
or if you're going to go down that way cooler sounding narrative, it's a symbol of the unsaid. We've all got stuff we've not said. You
Yeah,
know, you know.
yeah.
I went into saw my mate the other day. His shirt smelt of damp, but he was having a bad day, so I wasn't going to tell him that his shirt smelt of damp. I didn't suddenly start getting globus sensation and rolling around everywhere because of the unsaid. I was just like, "No," just like
I
he
heard
doesn't
that
listen
one.
to this podcast, thankfully.
I love it. See, like, I thought my little take earlier was spicy. No, that was wasted. The non-Netflix. Ooh, shots fired. I heard
No,
that with
honestly, it
and
really
watched
is, and this
it.
is why people love the stuff of like Gabor Mate and Bessel van der Kolk, because it sounds applicable. It's like, wow, there's something kind of mysterious to explain this. Now, don't get me wrong, they've got some really valid stuff in there, but when
Yeah,
it's the only narrative, you
yeah,
know, ADHD, anxiety is caused by trauma, all of it. No, that's quite a reductive narrative, and actually, it harms people who are trying to carve their own narrative.
yeah.
And I always start simple. Now, I'm going to get off my soapbox and stop ranting.
Fair enough. I think another narrative that is hard to again, this is starting to sound, we didn't do this episode so that we get like, oh, we're better than the trauma narrative. No, it's not that at all, or just picking on the trauma narrative. But there's also the physiological narratives.
Mhm.
So like I had a situation come up where it's like, well, such and such an influencer says, like, okay, yeah, I know the guy with the doctor of chiropractic tells you that your brain lives in your body, so therefore you must feed your brain. Yeah, yeah, it does live in your body. You're actually right, but that is a tough one too, because then we have the wellness narratives that have focus a lot on physiology, movement, diet. Like, oh, you don't understand, the way out of an anxiety disorder is movement. Like, well, yeah, yeah, it's part of it, or it's
And
diet. Like,
fixing your gut biome.
right, like all of those things. So that there's those narratives, and then I'm not even talking about the therapist or helper narrative. It could confuse your own narrative.
Mm.
So if you listen to this podcast, how many times do we hear like, I don't even know who to listen to? I hear every day, who am I supposed to? Who do I trust? One
Yeah, it's
person says it's
tricky,
my
isn't it?
gut. One person says I have to move my body and experience somatically, and another person says I have to dig for pain, and another person says that it's not pain, and I have to just do. What do I do?
And
You have a
two
hard time
two
building
morons on a podcast tell me I should ignore it, and
stupid sound effects. All they do is play silly sounds and make themselves laugh. So it can be so confusing to even have a well-defined personal narrative before you even know what to do. I think I'm just trying to acknowledge that. It can be really hard,
I
especially now.
yeah, the more this goes on, the more I realize how important it is, like, and I
Yeah.
think that's what a good anxiety disorder informed therapist will do. That's why I love a formulation. So part of cognitive behavioral therapy is we constantly keep revisiting the formulation. What's the problem here?
Yep.
What do we
Because it's
do
going to shift.
next?
Yeah,
It will
it's going to
shift. Yeah.
shift. Yeah, 100%. And sometimes I think for me, what I find is, yeah, the narrative that you have that isn't, you don't have to abandon it. So sometimes I'll tell people like, we just have to put that aside for now. Like, I'm not saying that's wrong, but for now, let's try it. Would you be open to trying this just to see
Mm.
what happens? And then we can maybe bring that narrative back in, or you can on your own, or you can work with somebody else that you like. It doesn't matter. But for now, we got to try and work that in a way where we respect your belief or what you want to be true. But we also have to work in reality in the here and now. Sometimes
Yeah.
it's tricky. Yeah.
I
So,
saw it the other day, like with DPDR. Here's a tenuous plug. Drew and I
hmm,
are doing today. If you're someone who tunes into Disordered on the day,
that's right.
we're doing a DPDR workshop this evening UK time, which
Hmm,
is 8 p.m. But if you're not around, will it be available to download? But the reason why I bring that up is because with DPDR, which is what we'll be talking about, derealizing agent depersonalization, I'm part of these counselor therapy groups online on Facebook, and I go in to check and
hmm,
offer my 2 cents if anyone wants it.
yep.
And it's usually therapists asking really cool questions like, "How would you work with this?" And they're trying to broaden their horizons. And I get ones like on DPDR, and it's like different alternative narratives. Like if someone's experiencing dissociation, it's due to this and that and unresolved trauma from the past and this, and it's the body saying this and blah blah. And people forget just the most obvious, simple thing, like it's a stress response. I
Hmm,
got DPDR the other day, because I hadn't stopped. I didn't take a lunch break. And my body was like, I'm just going to dissociate because it's a stress response. I'm going to remind you
hmm,
that, this isn't sustainable. That was it. It wasn't because of these. That was it. No one
yeah.
offers that. And in this forum, it was like this group was like, you need to explore attachment to the self, inner child, inner parent, wounded child work, and all this stuff. It was like, or you could just be like, it's just a, it's just a symptom of anxiety, guys. You don't need to
Yeah.
add a narrative to it.
Well, that's the fixing narrative also, which can be confusing for people. If you listen to this podcast, it's really hard to okay. So if we're going to do like acceptance and tolerance based approaches to this, we're intentionally not trying to fix it. So I think one of the competing narratives from the anxious person's point of view is, oh yeah, that sounds right. Like this, oh my goodness. So many today. You hear those?
Are you on OK Cupid again?
Yeah, I don't know what's going
Getting a
on
few
there.
hits today.
Like, it already showed me that. Why are you showing it to me again? Anyway, sorry guys.
Is it
But
my
one of
newsletter? Sorry.
could have been right. Anxiety Josh newsletter. No, believe it or not, it's a calendar thing that tells me to produce this episode.
Again.
Yeah, that happened 2 weeks ago too, I think. But the conflicting narrative for the anxious person becomes, oh yeah, cool, this seems right. Like Claire Weeks, acceptance, and what Josh and Drew are saying, and people sound like us, yeah, accept it, don't fight it, blah blah blah, navigate through it, tolerate it. But I also like the fixing narrative, which is when I get anxious, I must do a thing that fixes it and calms it down. You cannot reconcile those two things. So I saw that in an ERP training that I did for, it was 4 days worth of training where there was a lot of confusion and many, I'm sure, excellent therapists who want to help kept asking the question, but when do I do the intervention? But when do I do the intervention? Like, in other words, my client is in a state of distress during this exposure and they're trying to engage in their ritual prevention and their distress level is up there. Like SUDS level is really high. When do I do the ventral vagal, intervention? And the answer is you don't. And so it's
Polyvagal narrative.
right. So it was really hard for the, and again, I'm sure excellent therapists. I'm not picking on anybody, but like that's from the therapist side, from the anxious person side. Oh, I want to do acceptance, but I also want you to teach me how to stop the panic when it happens. Oh, but you can't reconcile. That's conflicting narrative. That
Conflicting
will drive you
narratives.
in a circle and wonder, like, I don't understand. Why isn't it? I do the things I don't avoid. I'm going shopping, I go to work, but I'm not getting better. You may have conflicting narratives that you're hanging on to. No, I'm not talking about the helpers. You
Mm.
yourself might be trying to have two things true at the same time. They can't be.
Mm.
So this is important. This was a great topic, man.
It
Should talk.
really, yeah, it's interesting. It's an interesting one. So, yeah, if you're someone in conclusion,
Yeah.
if you're someone who's a bit like, I am being bombarded with different narratives and forms of information about how to kind of help my anxiety, whether it's online, maybe it's even your own therapist
Mhm.
or a friend who's perhaps been through their own anxiety issues. You work on crafting your own narrative for you. And
Yeah.
that's important. And when you craft it, you get the credit as well. I've crafted
Yeah.
my own narrative. I've taken the information. I know me better than anyone else. I know what compulsions I'm in, what safety behaviors I'm doing, and I know I need to work on maybe surrendering or willful tolerance or practicing with uncertainty. And that's my narrative. And I crafted that. And I'm going to get to the end of that and, live a content life. Try not, and this particularly applies to resource gatherers. I need to go out.
Yeah.
Maybe there's one more thing that another anxiety expert is saying or whatnot. You know, most people that do this already know enough. In my opinion, anyway.
Mhm. I think so too. The only thing I would add to that, the resource gathering is the part I was going to bring it up. Sometimes if you're really confused, but I don't know how to craft my personal narrative, maybe start with like, well, but I have to craft it. I cannot ask social media to give me the narrative. And okay, if you're looking for input, there's nothing wrong with that. That's not a crime. But at the same time, you might start with like, wait a minute, I've been trying that one and that's clearly not working for me. So I'm going to have to mute that one for now. And that might be disordered. You might have to stop listening to us if we're not working for you. That's okay. But you
Yeah.
may have to craft a personal narrative by subtraction. Like,
Mm.
oh, wait a minute, I've been trying this and this and this and this, and I'm still in the same boat and I'm feeling like I'm hopeless. I'm gonna have to start taking those things out of my narrative and trying other stuff that feels more right to me. So that's okay to do that. It's
I'll tell
allowed.
you what is good for your personal narrative is feeling scared and doing it anyway.
I heard that to be true. So let's check one of those out.
Hi, Josh and Drew. My name is Fernanda, and you can use my name. Thank you so much for everything that you do for this community on your podcast. I lived with GAD, OCD, panic, health anxiety, the whole nine yards for a long time. And today I want to share a did it anyway. I had a really stressful day at work and I wanted to act on my anxious impulses, but I heard your podcast last week about letting it just be there and not reacting to that shock and trying not to fight it. And I felt so much better. I went on my Peloton. I watched Survivor with my husband, and it was really good. Thank you for everything that you do. I'm going to remember you guys when I conquer my biggest anxiety challenge yet next year, going to a foreign country that really triggers me and makes me anxious. Thanks again. Enjoy your day.
Good
Really
job.
good. I like that. I like the attitude shift to it. It's really well done, and no doubt that you'll go get through your trip to the foreign country.
Today,
So,
I learned that Survivor is still a thing. Who knew?
yeah. Also, interestingly, that did it anyway reminded me of an interoceptive exposure I did with a client many years ago. Do you remember when the Sex in the City reboot came out and they had Peloton? It was like they had a Peloton bike, and one of
Yeah.
the
The guy
characters like
died, didn't he?
had a heart attack on the Peloton bike.
Yep. Yeah.
Yeah, one of the exposures was someone who had cardiophobia, and I was like, and they had a bike. I don't know if it was a Peloton. If they had a bike, I said, watch that episode whilst going on your bike. There's a good exposure, and they did it. To be fair, and I was really proud of them. And yeah, just to teach the brain that just because you're seeing it, it doesn't mean it's a thing.
I'm looking. Used to be. Does he still? The guy that died. The character. I'm sorry. Yeah, follows me on Instagram.
Really,
Chris
that's
Noth. He was the guy that played the guy that died on the Peloton, and I remember like he looks familiar to me, and I was like, oh my god, that's the guy from Sex and the City. I don't know the character name, but like, yeah, he died in the
well,
episode.
when you're A-listers like you and I, Drew, like
Oh, it's
you
just
get all sorts.
it's so hard. I get out of bed. I just wade through the sea of celebrities clamoring around me. It's really hard.
I've got one written. Did it anyway. We'll do the question next time, just because aware of the time. There's a therapy trope. I'm just aware of the time. I'm just aware of the time. Hi, Josh and Drew. Loving the work you both do. As someone who suffers from panic disorder and social anxiety, I spent every day for the last 8 months ensuring some form of panic attack or social anxiety or fearful state, enduring. And I wanted to share. I did it anyway. The last 4 times I've been out to eat with my family and partner, I have suffered terribly with panic attacks and being stuck with physical symptoms such as lead arms, the sensation losing control of my arms, cramping, and nausea. But this weekend, my family came down to where I live in London with my partner, and we went out twice. And although I experienced the symptoms and mental discomfort, I did it anyway and held my 1-year-old niece in my lap and enjoyed a nice weekend with my family. Thank you, too, for making me believe recovery is possible and making it feel like nothing to be ashamed of. Well done, my dudes.
Oh, another one. That was really awesome.
Oh, I love that. You did the opposite. So I've got lead arms. I can't control. No, I'll hold my knees.
Lead arms is. I don't think I've ever heard that term before. It's really good. Lead arms.
Yeah. Well, I can show you some steel arms.
Oh no. I walk myself.
That's the cue to leave. Thank you for tuning. Oh, but before we go, keep an eye out for Disordered Roundtable. It's coming soon. Very frequently, maybe every week, every couple of weeks, Drew and I will invite to do like a live discussion. If you want to come in, be a limited amount of seats available. If you want to come in, sit on the round table, ask a question, share your experience. We want to be more involved with the community and spend more of our time with you guys. But yeah, keep an eye out for that. If not, follow us on social media or tune in every Friday.
Yeah, of course, if you're digging the podcast, leave a review on Apple or Spotify. Just saying. All right, guys, thanks for listening.
Not 5 stars. Keep your review to yourself.
We'll see you guys next week. We're out.